Good morning, Year 11s. Today we're going to be looking at Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander observations and science. As always, we're going to start with our do now questions, so you might want to pause the video here and write these down if you're writing them in your book. Alternatively, if you're using the Google Slides, these questions will be on the Google slide. I'd like you to provide your answer underneath each of the questions. I'll read each question now. Question 1. On the graph, label the x-axis and the y-axis. If you see the graph on the right-hand side of the page here, I would like you to write where you think the x-axis is and where you think the y-axis is. Question 2. What was the scientific name of Alexander Fleming's mould? What was the scientific name of Alexander Fleming's mould? Question 3. pH is a measure of what? pH is a measure of what? Question 4. How does Jupiter protect Earth? How does Jupiter protect Earth? And question 5. How are the Northern Lights created? How are the Northern Lights created? So please have an attempt at these. If you need to pause the video, that's okay. I'll go over the answers quickly now. So on the following graph, label the x and y axis. Here we go. X is on the bottom, y is vertical. So x is horizontal, going across the way, and y is horizontal. And one of the ways that I remember this is that y has that sort of vertical stem as well. So always write the y first, and then x is on the horizontal axis. What was the scientific name of Alexander Fleming's mould? It was Penicillium notatum. Number 3, pH is a measure of what? pH is a measure of how acidic or basic something is. So if something is very acidic, it has a low pH. If something is really alkaline or basic, it has a higher pH. And the middle is 7, and that's pure water. So if you're above 7, you'd be considered basic or alkaline. If you're below 7, acidic. 4. How does Jupiter protect Earth? Well, it has a strong gravitational pull that attracts large meteorites and asteroids that otherwise could impact Earth. So we can still be impacted by meteorites. We saw that 65 million years ago at the end of the KT boundary, which ended the dinosaurs. However, we are protected by a lot of massive asteroids by Jupiter purely by being in our solar neighbourhood and attracting large bodies of rock that would otherwise impact the Earth. And how are the Northern Lights created? They're created by Earth's magnetic field, and we can see the Northern Lights when they deflect solar radiation. And if you've seen the images before, we know that the magnetic field is strongest at the poles, so you're most likely to see the southern and northern lights in the north and south poles, or close to them. Okay, today we're looking at Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander observations and science. So we're still looking at observations as part of this module. And when we think about farming, which we're going to talk about today, this is kind of what we'd probably think about, this traditional European farming. We see nice rows of farms here, a little settlement, and it looks quite maintained, but then you have your forest all around you. And these maintained areas is where you would grow your crops traditionally. So this might be our traditional image of what European farming or farming from European settlers would look like. We're going to talk about Aboriginal farming today, before European settlement. And this is Mount Eccles, and this picture was taken in 2007. And I want you to consider a few questions when you look at this image. I want you to think, what did this land look like before European settlers arrived, and why? So just what your idea may be. So it doesn't have to be the correct answer, but what do you think this land looked like? I'll show you the picture again. What do you think this land looked like before European settlers arrived? So again, you may want to write these questions in your book, or if you're working along in Google Classrooms, that's cool. You may want to pause the video here and just think, what do you think it would have looked like before? Okay, well, we have some paintings that were taken by European settlers when they arrived, and this is the sort of image we have compared to the previous image. So you can see quite a stark difference in Mount Echoes before European settlement. The main things that are pretty obvious are these kind of deep grooves or areas of cleared areas of grassland instead of just completely dense forest. And you can see they look like they're kind of a little bit in an order, particularly the vertical lines. We have clearances here separated by some woodland, a clearance, woodland, clearance, and woodland. And this was designed specifically to hunt animals. So you would know, for example, we all know where kangaroos are grazing on grass. If these areas are cleared, then the kangaroos are going to congregate here. And if you're hunting, that's quite good for you to know, okay, they're always going to be in those regions. You don't need to go searching for miles and miles. They're always going to be in these wooded regions. And what we can see also is the mature trees only really seem to be in the foreground here. So there's not as many mature trees across this whole region. And if I just show you that photograph again, it looks quite different to what it looks like nowadays. It's just dense forest. There's no broken up areas of grassland. And this is just dense wooded vegetation now. So how did that happen? How did they make that happen? Well, one of the people that actually figured this out or contributed really quite well to our now understanding of it was a guy called Bill Gamage. And he believed if Aboriginal Australians had been on the land for 40,000 years, why were there no big trees then? Why was it different to what we see today? And Bill Gamage is an adjunct professor and senior research fellow at the Humanities Research Centre at ANU. And Gamage was born not too far from here in Orange in New South Wales. And what Gamage did is he looked through a bunch of paintings that were taken by the early settlers. And a lot of the paintings showed the image that I showed you before, with the grassland punctuated by woodland. So there was these open areas. And he eventually wrote a book on it called The Biggest Estate on Earth, How Aborigines Made Australia. And estates in the UK are referred to when we talk about kind of manicured areas. Could be parkland, could be areas that are owned by landowners. So estates are basically areas that are very well manicured. And what the European settlers really said when they arrived was that Australia just looked like one big park. I took some Year 11s to Makati Park last week, and you could see how manicured it is. The grass looked fantastic. All the flowers were well maintained. The hedges have been really trimmed back as well. So when you look, or the early settlers when they arrived, when they looked out into Australia, it looked so well manicured that they thought it was just one big park. So the biggest estate on earth is a reference to that. Here are some of the paintings that Gamage looked through. And you can see these areas, these open areas of grassland. And I'll stop in this picture here. And like I said before, what that allowed Aboriginal people to do was essentially herd or know where the kangaroos were going to be. They had designed these areas to encourage grazing of kangaroos in certain regions in the territory, in their country, and that would allow them to have a pretty, not limitless, but they'd know that the food security was pretty good if the kangaroos were going to be there all the time or most of the time. So if they needed to get some protein, they weren't spending days hunting down mobs of kangaroo. So how did they make these clearances? They didn't have lawnmowers and cut the grass, so how did they make such fantastic looking habitats and ecosystems? Well, they used this process called Firestick farming. And essentially what they would do is take a stick of fire stick, and burn off all the undergrowth, the vegetation around these massive trees. What that would do would burn back the stunted vegetation, the grass on this level here, and that would allow new shoots and grass to grow through. What that would also do is limit the saplings of new trees, so you don't have a big forested area. You have your mature trees and a few younger trees over here, but you don't have this massive dense forest of vegetation. It keeps it quite open. So a definition of firestick burning would be a traditional practice of the Aboriginal people of Australia, whereby areas of bushland or other vegetation can be lit on fire so that other plants can grow. So this is what it would look like in practice, okay? Also known as a controlled burn, because it's not being caused to cause mass devastation like we saw in the summer. They'd be in controlled regions at specific times of the year, which we'll talk about later on. Why is this so important? Well, we know fire is a natural part of the ecosystem here in Australia. Perhaps the most amazing fire adaptation is that some species actually require fire for their seeds to sprout. And these are called pyrophytic plants. Pyrophytic or pyrophytic plants. Some plants, such as the lodgepole pine, eucalyptus and banksia, have serratinous cones or fruits that are completely sealed with resin. These cones and fruits can only open to release their seeds after the heat of a fire has physically melted the resin. Okay, so they won't actually release their seeds unless there is a fire. That's an amazing evolutionary adaptation to an environment, which would obviously suggest there's a lot of fire on this continent if the plants need fire to be able to grow properly and reproduce. So these controlled burns fit in really nicely with what actually is naturally happening in an ecosystem, but humans are perhaps controlling them in a better way to suit their needs. This is an example of one of the cones, okay? Before and after fire. So you can see it's opened right up here. So in this picture here, the resin is holding this pine cone together. And when we get a fire, it burns that resin away and the pine cone can open up, releasing its seeds. So this is quite an amazing photograph here, before and after fire. So I used the word serontony, and you may not have heard of that before. So I'd like you to take this definition down, please. Serontony is an ecological adaptation exhibited by some seed plants in which seed release occurs in response to an environmental trigger rather than spontaneously at seed maturation. So it's not just restricted to fire, but this is a really fantastic example. So I'll read that again. It's an ecological adaptation exhibited by some seed plants in which seed release occurs in response to an environmental trigger rather than spontaneously at seed maturation. Now, that's quite clever if you're a plant and you're waiting for the right environmental conditions to occur so you can then release your seeds and ensure the seeds have the best opportunity to mature and become plants of their own. It's quite risky if that doesn't happen. Imagine the environmental trigger you required was fire, for example, and then the fire stopped. Then there is no way that you're going to disperse your seeds. So there's that evolutionary trade-off as well, but it's quite an amazing evolutionary feat to see how closely linked these plants are to their environment. Okay, resprouting is another adaptation. So though wildfires inevitably kill and injure many organisms in their path, a number of plants have adapted to resprout if they are damaged in a blaze. Some of these resprouters, including several eucalyptus species, have specialised buds that are protected under the bark of their trees. When the trees are burned, these buds emerge to produce new leaves and branches. So these are photographs. I think this is a Shark Bay in New South Wales, if memory serves. And we've obviously had some devastating fires. In some areas, plants are beginning to regrow. It's not the case across everywhere, but we're finding that these plants that are particularly adapted to fire are starting to resprout. So the buds are held underneath the bark. When the bark is burned, it kind of sends a signal to the tree that those buds could burst through and become new leaves. So that's an amazing adaptation as well to fire. So what are the pros of doing this firestick farming, this technique? Well, it prevents bushfires. By burning an area, it prevents buildup of a lot of dry foliage, therefore stopping big bushfires and wildfires. So we heard a lot of that in the news recently about the fuel loading or the amount of fuel that was under the trees, which contributed, we think, to the devastation of the bushfires recently. It helps new plants to grow and seeds to open. Some seeds need fire or heat to open, so by burning some of the land, it helps new trees and plants to grow. It also clears the leaves so that more sunlight can get to sprouts and help them grow. It can help plants develop to become more fire resistant. So they're the benefits, the pros of firestick farming. What are the cons then? What are the downsides of farming like this? Well, this may be an extreme example, but we saw all of us kind of struggled in the summer to breathe at certain points, particularly in regions like Sydney, where the smoke descended on entire cities. So smoke is something we need to consider as a downside or a negative related to burning any sort of vegetation. Why is that important? Well, there's a video that I'll put onto Google Classrooms, which talks about a study that was conducted in California. So unfortunately, they've suffered from similar sized fires in the state of California in America, USA. And they looked at some monkeys that were in a zoo that were in one of the smoke affected areas, and they've looked at the development since and found some pretty troubling results about the long-term consequences of smoke on lung health. And most people that were in the most affected areas were advised to wear masks. And nobody really knows, it's not just to keep the smoke out, it's particular aspects of the smoke, which we'll talk about. So, particular, excuse the pun, but lungs and particulate matter. Can't say that very well. But bushfires are so dangerous because they billow fine particulate matter, known as PM 2.5, into the air. And I'll define that better in a second. When this is inhaled, so PM 2.5, when this is inhaled, it can go deep into the lungs where it causes inflammation and into the bloodstream to affect other parts of the body. The link between several hours or days of poor air quality and health problems is well established. Such exposure can worsen asthma and lung conditions, such as chronic bronchitis, and lead to heart attack in people with heart disease. So PM 2.5 is related to particulate matter. I can't say that word, unfortunately. Particulate matter, which is 2.5 or below in size, so small bits of matter. So particles less than 2.5 micrometers in diameter, PM 2.5, can penetrate deeply into the lung, irritate and corrode the alveolar wall, the alveoli, and consequently impair lung function. Hence, it is important to investigate the impact of PM 2.5. So if you look at this diagram here, we have particles that are less than 2.5 can get in there. They enter through the nose and the mouth. Larger particles, such as PM10, are eliminated through coughing, sneezing, and swallowing. So our body's innate immune system can get rid of these larger particles, but the smaller particles get through, and these are the ones that cause the problems. So smaller particles, such as PM 2.5, can travel deep into the lungs, causing lung and heart problems. So this is a real downside, particularly the last summer. It was particularly bad, and when you had days and days of exposure, particularly in the large urban centres like Sydney, there's a lot of people that are getting exposed to PM 2.5s, which is not good for their long-term lung health. Another downside, which is speculative, and there's a lot of evidence and contradicting evidence, I guess, online, but it makes sense when you look at the arrival of humans to the continent, that these Aboriginal Australians predate the extinction of Australian megafauna. And this is associated with a loss of browsing and grazing animals, resulted in savanna changing into dry forest. So the ecosystem has changed so much through this firestick farming that we believe megafauna became extinct. What are megafauna? Megafauna are large mammals of a particular region, habitat, or geological period. And Australia had some fantastic megafauna until fairly recently in geological time. We look at a few of them here. So we have a bunch of large mammals, and in some cases large reptiles and birds living on this continent. If you think from a human perspective, we would benefit, I guess, from taking a large animal if we're going to go hunting, and that would provide more protein. However, for the animal, that's not very good for them, particularly if they're large and slow. It's quite easy to hunt them to extinction, which we believe is what we did. What we're going to do right now, though, is have a look at some of these different types of animals. It's good to be familiar with them. Some of them are absolutely huge. This is the short-faced kangaroo, and you can see this image here, and we've got some people in the background. So 3 meters tall, which is ridiculous, and you can see the diprotodons, which are basically large wombats, almost the size of elephants. These are massive, massive animals that were roaming around the continent not that long ago. So why we believe that humans were really the cause of the extinction: when we arrived, or Aboriginal people arrived in Australia, which we believe between 50 and 60,000 years ago now, these megafauna started to go extinct about 15, 20,000 years later. So that's a substantial amount of time to be coexisting from our point of view, but quite quickly after the arrival of humans, these large, massive animals started to go extinct. So we believe that the efficiency, how good it is to use the Firestick farming for hunting and basically shepherding animals into certain regions, that can cause problems for the animals if we're not careful and drive them to extinction. So what we're going to look at today is, on the Google Classroom, there are some megafauna profiles. What I'd like you to do is pick one of those profiles, and you're going to write a little bit about the animal that you've chosen. What I'd like you to do is write a short paragraph, either in your book or on Google Classrooms, on the animal that you've read about. Include the name of the animal, its scientific name. So if I go back here, the scientific name here, Diprotodon optatum, is the scientific name. The habitat it preferred to live in, and the type of diet it ate. So I want you to do that in your book or in Google Classrooms using the PDFs that I've uploaded to the Year 11 Science Classroom. Okay, thank you.